Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here this morning with us. Um, Today, we are going to spend some time talking about the E-2 visa options where the investment amount is low and other types of risky E-2 cases. Just a few things before we get started. My name is Jelena Gilliam. I am an associate here at the firm. And as some of you may know, the firm was founded on an E-2 visa 10 years ago. Our founder is on an E-2 visa, and we have renewed once, and we can also share that experience with you. The firm is a full-service immigration firm, but we primarily focus on E-2 visas. We've processed hundreds of them and typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk, aka lower investment amounts. We will continue this webinar series doing at least two webinars a month on different immigration topics. And at the end of this webinar, we'll send out a few things. The PowerPoint presentation you'll see today, a comprehensive E-2 visa guide, a link to where you can sign up for additional webinars. For our panelists today, we have Kelly LeGrand Weiner, who's a partner at the firm, who has a vast experience processing E-2 visas. My name is Jelena Gilliam, and I am an associate here at the firm, and I'll be the moderator for today. And if you have any questions, please send it through the chat box. And lastly, the webinar will be recorded and available on demand. So without further delay, I am going to turn it over to Kelly to start the presentation.
Thank you, Jelena. All right, we're going to start by just talking a little bit about the basic E-2 visa requirements. So first requirement, you have to be a national of a treaty country. This is a treaty investor visa. So there are various countries that have treaties with the United States for reciprocal treatment of U.S. citizens and the citizens of that country. So there's many treaty countries. There's a list there. Sometimes new countries are added. Portugal was recently added to the list. A few years prior, Israel was added to the list. Also, sometimes treaties lapse. Iran is no longer on the list. So always good to check that to see if you are a national of a treaty country. And that means you have a passport for that country. Unfortunately, India and China are not on the list, but there are many countries that are all over the world in Europe, Middle East, Asia, Africa. Another requirement is that you have to own at least 50% of the E-2 company in order to be an E-2 investor applicant. You also have to make an investment, and the investment has to be substantial, and the funds also have to be at risk and irrevocably committed. And we'll talk a little later in the presentation about what substantial means. When we say the funds have to be at risk, essentially what this means is that they actually have to be spent. You cannot kind of start up a new entity, open a business bank account, transfer a lump sum of money, and then apply. The money actually has to be put at risk so that the officers feel that the applicant, is more likely than not to actually, proceed with the business plan, that they've put enough of their capital at risk in the commercial sense. They have enough buy-in that they're going to go forward with the business plan. So, if it's a startup, you're going to, spend money on, typical things such as inventory, equipment, a website, office supplies, a warehouse, commercial office space, marketing, business entity setup. So these are just some of the common expenditures that we see for kind of startup companies. It obviously will depend based on what type of company you're starting. For example, if you're starting up a food truck company, you would need to purchase the actual truck and outfit the truck. So there's going to be some very specific expenditures you have to make. And the key is that you're spending everything that's necessary to get this particular type of business up and running. When they look at substantiality, that's what they're really looking at. Did you invest a substantial amount in light of the total startup costs for this particular type of business? So obviously a consulting company may have lower startup costs, whereas, a company that's going to manufacture something would have much higher startup costs. I also want to talk about the investment when you're starting a new business versus purchasing a business. So when you're starting up a new business, then you're having to kind of make all the expenditures to get the business to the point of being operational to prove it's substantial. If you're purchasing a business, then generally anything the business is like if the business is being offered on the market for a certain price, that's going to be the fair market value. And if you're spending that amount to purchase the company, that should be considered substantial. That may change if it's not an arm's length transaction. If you're buying the business from a friend, from a relative, then there's going to be more scrutiny on that. You might want to get a valuation. One important thing you can do when purchasing a business is you can put money into escrow. And so that's where instead of actually transferring the money to the seller to purchase the business, you can put the money into, send the money to an escrow agent. You have to have signed a purchase sale agreement. All conditions for the sale have to have been concluded, except there can be one condition that says this money is being put into escrow contingent on the E-2 visa being granted. If it is not granted, the money will be returned to the buyer. If it is granted, the money must go to the seller. So in this particular situation, the escrow situation does allow, the buyer to protect themselves in the event the E-2 is not granted. So sometimes purchasing a business as opposed to starting up a business can be an attractive option because you can kind of mitigate your risk a bit more. Another requirement is the business cannot be marginal. So this means the business has to support more than just the investor and their family and must have the capability of making a significant economic contribution. Really, what this translates to is they want to see that the business is hiring employees in the United States. So this is a very important part of any E-2 application. The E-2 is really not meant for someone to come in and be a solo consultant. They really do want to see that the business is going to be large enough to support more than just the consultant and to hire workers in the United States. Another requirement is the business has to be real and operating. So this means if it's kind of already an active business, if you're purchasing a business and it's been operating for several years, you're going to show things like tax returns, payroll summaries, invoices, maybe website reviews, anything that shows that this has been an actively trading business. If it's a startup business that you're starting, then you would need to show that the business is ready to start operating after the E-2 is granted. So for the real and operating requirement for a startup, they look at things like, do you have a commercial office lease? Is your business entity set up? Do you have a business bank account? Has the company website been created and gone live? Do you have all the licenses you need to run this type of business? Do you have contracts or maybe letters of intent with prospective clients? So these are all the types of things you would show for real and operating with the startup. Another requirement is you have to be entering the US solely to develop and direct the E-2 enterprise. So the E-2 is not for people that want to kind of retire to the United States. It doesn't allow you to be purely passive. That being said, really what they want the E2 investor to be doing is high level development and direction of the business. So really you should be hiring people to do kind of the day-to-day operational work, and you as the investor are focused on developing and directing the company. And then often this goes along with showing you have that 50% or more, ownership of the company. So you have the ability to control the company and make all the decisions. Finally, you have to show you have the intent to return to your home country upon the expiration of the E-2 visa. So the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that doesn't allow for this dual intent. That being said, it does have a very low standard for proving that you have a non-immigrant intent. So all you need to show is usually a letter saying that you intend to depart the United States when the visa, period has ended. That being said, E-2 visas can be renewed indefinitely for as long as the business meets all the E-2 requirements. So you are permitted to move your residence to the United States. You don't have to prove that you have a residence in your home country, but you do have to, be able to explain to the officer and have them feel that, you're being honest when you say that you do not intend to live in the United States permanently or pursue the green card process. One thing I want to go back to on the investment section is just the source of funds. So for any investment that you make, you will have to show the legitimate source of where that money came from. So if it's, for example, your personal savings from employment, you're going to show your tax returns. If it's a gift from somebody, you'd have a gift letter and then proof of where they earned the money. Maybe you sold a property. If it's from that, you'd show a purchase sale agreement and proof of you receiving the money from the property. So that is an important part of the investment requirement. All right, talking a little bit more about E-2 requirements and how long the E-2 visa can last for. So as I mentioned previously, this visa is only available to nationals of certain countries. It is a great visa for anyone that wants to kind of be an entrepreneur. You will have to make that investment either by purchasing an existing business or starting a new business. And in terms of how long the E-2 visa is valid for, this is going to depend on the specifics of the treaty between the United States and your country. So there's something called a reciprocity schedule that you can check that will show you how long the E-2 visa can be granted for if you're a national of a particular country. So, for example, in Canada, you can get a 5-year multiple entry E-2 visa. Whereas in Egypt or in Bangladesh, you can only get a 3-month single entry visa. That being said, every time you enter on the visa is your entry document, you can be given 2 years in E2 status. So if you have a 3-month visa and you enter, you can be given 2 years to stay in the United States and run the company. And if you have a 5-year visa, you'll also only be given 2 years in your status. If you have the 5-year visa, it's a bit easier because you can just leave before the 2 years are up. And each time you re-enter, you'll be given 2 more years in E2 status. If you have a 3-month visa and if it's single entry, then the first time you leave the US, you'll likely need to go and get a new visa stamp from the consulate before you can re-enter. You can also choose to just stay in the United States for 2 years, run the company, and go get a new visa at a later time. All right, let's talk a little bit more about investment and how much is enough. I think sometimes we have clients who confuse the E2 with the EB5, where the EB5 is a green card, an investment green card that does have specific, very high amounts that you have to invest. The E2 is much more flexible than that. So there is no number that's in the regulations. What it says is you have to invest a substantial amount of money. And what is substantial is going to depend on the type of business you're starting. So as we talked about earlier, like, a consulting or maybe a service-based business like a law firm is going to have much lower startup expenses, whereas there's some businesses that have extremely high startup expenses. If you're starting up a chain of restaurants, or anything that has, is going to require a lot of space, a lot of equipment, a lot of inventory. And what they look at is this proportionality test. So, how much have you invested versus the total cost to establish this type of business? So, for a consulting company where you might argue, well, I could start this up with very little money. Maybe we're arguing the total investment is around, 60, 70, $100,000. You want to have spent a very high proportion of that because it is a lower investment amount. Whereas if somebody was making an enormous investment, where let's say arguable startup costs were like $100 million, if they invested $10 million, that might be considered substantial, even though related to the total startup costs, the percentage is low because the magnitude of the investment is so high at $10 million, that would likely still qualify for the E2 visa. What we're going to talk about today with our kind of lower investment amounts and risky cases, we really see a lot, people investing somewhere, around maybe 80 to $150,000 with about half of that spent. And that generally has, been sufficient at certain consulates. And we'll talk more about that later. Some consulates are really not as receptive to low investment amounts, and others are much more receptive. Um, it can be good to provide evidence of what reasonable startup costs are to the consulate. Sometimes you can find, media articles or business magazine articles that talk about normal startup costs for certain types of businesses. Maybe they say even, for consulting, it's as low as $2,000 to $5,000. If you can provide an article like that and then explain, and I've spent $70,000, it can be favorable to show you really have spent everything necessary to get the business up and running and that it should be considered substantial. CPA letters can sometimes also be helpful, having a CPA evaluate your business plan, especially if it's a CPA that works with kind of businesses, similar to yours, and explaining that the startup costs that you have invested in, are reasonable for this type of business. For the proportionality test, when we talk about buying a business, the purchase price, generally, if it's the fair market value, again, if it's an arm's length transaction, that's generally going to be considered sufficient to be substantial. Whereas if you are, buying a business from a related party, you may want to get a valuation or, have a CPA look at the financials and opine that the invest that the amount that is being asked is reasonable. And always in a purchase scenario, the amount that you're spending to purchase the business should make sense kind of in light of the business financials, right? So if the business is showing really high assets, lots of cash flow, very successful, and you're spending a very low amount for it, that's going to raise questions for the officer. All right, let's talk about some strategies to deal with a low dollar amount. So it's always good that if you have a low dollar amount, you want to make sure that every other part of the application is as strong as possible. So the real and operating, the marginality section, you want to have a really strong business plan. You want to show, market interest in your business. Maybe get contracts, letters of intent from clients. It can also be very favorable to make connections with local business organizations, for example, the local Chamber of Commerce. Sometimes they will, write, if you join the local Chamber of Commerce, and meet with them, they may write a letter saying, yes, we're looking forward to having this business in our community. It's going to create jobs and generate revenue. Um, Always really important if you already have company activity or sales, maybe you're outside the US, running the business remotely. You can also provide those, bank statements as proof, of the income. A strong business plan is very, very important. So the business plan is really going to explain to the officer, here's what this business does. Here's our marketing strategy. Here's our sales strategy. Here's why our 5 years of financials are reasonable. Here's our 5-year hiring plan. Here's why that is reasonable. So all of that is really important for the officer to get a sense of the business and make sure that they believe it's, real and operating and not marginal. Hiring U.S. employees prior to applying is also very favorable. Again, this goes to, marginality, showing the business will support more than just the investor and their family. It also can be favorable because if you hire an employee, anything you pay that employee and any ancillary expenses related to that employee, like insurance, payroll, all of those can be included as E2 expenses, and they're quite strong E2 expenses. Um, you may also want to consider that CPA letter. So again, having if you have a really low investment amount, you want to be able to argue, this is a sufficient amount to get this business up and running. I really have spent everything that's necessary. That's why this should be considered substantial. And sometimes a letter from an outside professional can be helpful. All right, let's talk about some common E2 visa expenditures. So when you're thinking about expenditures, it does need to make sense in light of the type of business you have, right? So if you're starting up a business that absolutely requires a specific type of commercial space, like a restaurant, obviously that needs to be secured as part of, the process. But then there's also some just very common expenditures that apply to most businesses, and we've listed a lot of those here. So most businesses are going to need a website and ongoing fees for kind of website hosting. Most people are going to need a computer, printer, scanner, tablets, iPads. Even if you already have it for yourself, for the employees that you're going to hire, you would need to buy that equipment. If you're the type of business that requires inventory, that can be included. That's a great E2 expense. Furniture can be included if you're furnishing, a commercial space. So if you say, well, I'm going to get this dining room set and I'm going to mostly be working in my dining room, that's not a good E2 expense. And they're very sensitive to that. They will look at furniture purchases and sometimes ask for photos of, we want to see this furniture in an actual commercial office space. Similarly, like if you are, saying, well, I'm going to work out of my home, so can't I use what I pay for my mortgage or my rent, my residential rent as an E2 expense? Those again cannot be used for E2 expenditures. They'll just discount them, they'll just remove them from the schedule, and it makes the case look weaker. Trademark or intellectual property, especially the intellectual property, if that can be valued in an objective way, that can also be included. Any employee payroll, any independent contractor payments. Maybe you're not ready to hire an employee yet, but you have a contractor, that's going to do some work for you while you're getting things up and running. Anything you pay to that person can be included as an E2 expense. Commercial office space. Sometimes, especially for consulting companies, maybe they prepay a certain amount of rent to try to get their investment amount higher. Anything you paid to set up your business entity, office supplies. For training courses, sometimes this can be utilized, sometimes not. So, for example, someone starting up a law firm, something you pay to take the bar, that's not going to be included. But if there was a specific training course, a specific certification, like, for a marketing professional that you felt was really useful, that could potentially be included. It's not the strongest expense, but it's kind of a, fact specific situation. Any licensing fees that you pay, any licenses your business needs, those can be included. Sponsorship or trade show appearances. So we'll talk about this on the next slide, but for those types of appearances, you don't include everything you spend, right? Like things like gas, food, meal, like none of, hotels, those are really not ever good E2 expenditures. They weaken the case to add them in. Officers don't like to see them. They'll often just remove them. However, if you're going to a particular, business trade show that's very favorable, the amount that you pay to kind of register for that could be considered a business expense. Purchase of real property. So if you actually are going to purchase land for your company, that can be included. That being said, if you want to be careful about if you have a mortgage, because anything that is any loan that is secured by the assets of the E2 business cannot be included as investment. Cars and trucks. So as mentioned here, these can be expenditures if they're exclusively used for the business. So if you have a food truck and you need, you're buying a truck for that purpose, it's a taxi service or it's a construction company, and there's going to be branding on the vehicle and it's only going to be used to haul, construction materials, then that can be used. It's not a good idea to include a car as an expense if the way you're including it is, well, I need a car for my personal use, and then I'm also going to drive around and see clients, or I'm going to drive around. That often I think weakens using a car as an E2 expense. Software, advertising, all really good E2 expenditures. They often really want to see, a high marketing spend to understand how is your business going to get clients. So those are always good expenditures. Let's talk about some weak expenditures. So travel, flights, as we listed here, unless it's for a very specific conference or a business related activity. But even then, it's not a very strong expense. Many consulates even have on their website under the FAQs, do not include travel, do not include hotel, do not include meals. They really don't want to see, if you say, well, I took out some potential clients for, a great night and we went to Cirque du Soleil and all of that. They don't want to see any of those expenditures. They don't view them as kind of strong E2 expenditures. Also, any expenses that are kind of directly reimbursed by a client where there's kind of not any markup. If it's just, the client paid you a deposit and then you use that deposit to pay for something, that's not going to count. And then expenses paid to related parties, you want to be really careful about this. Like, let's say that you own two companies and one of the companies does website development. And so you pay the other company you own to do the website development. It's really not a strong E2 expense. Ultimately, if an officer looks at this and discovers that you are the owner of both companies, it doesn't look like the money is being put at risk. It looks like it's just being transferred back and forth between two companies that you own. And so for situations like that, we don't recommend doing that. Ultimately, if the officer discovers it, it could, really lead the officer to question your credibility. And that can be a very hard thing to overcome, if you're denied on that basis. All right, let's talk about some common challenges and tips for consulting businesses specifically. We have many, many people, where we do the E2s for consulting businesses. And a common thing they come and say is, I don't think I could qualify for this visa because I have nothing to spend money on. I have my contacts, I have my expertise, I own a computer, I don't need office space. What could I possibly spend money on? So theoretically, a very low investment is needed to start a consulting business. Sometimes almost no investment is needed. However, for the E2, you have to demonstrate you have put a substantial amount at risk to show you're committed to successfully operating the enterprise. The officer has to feel comfortable that you are committed that you have put enough at risk that you are committed to operating this business as outlined in your business plan. So what we try to do is, explain to people that yes, from an entrepreneurial perspective, maybe you could spend nothing and start this business, but in order to get the E2 visa, you do have to make this investment. So you want to think about, what kind of things would you need to spend money on maybe in the first year or two of operations, and see if maybe you can spend, some of that now to get the investment amount higher, but make sure you're spending money on things that make sense for your business. So for example, commercial office space, you can prepay for 6 months or maybe even 12 months, and that can get the investment amount higher. And even though many people say, well, I could operate from my residence, it really is for many reasons, specifically for the E2, a good idea to have a commercial address that is listed, where you're getting your business mail as opposed to having it be a residence. Similarly, equipment, so if you maybe you have a computer already, but you're going to have to buy computers for your employees. Or maybe you need to do an upgrade on your phone, or, if you in your office, maybe it's best to have kind of a TV for when you do client presentations. So you want to think about what equipment you're going to need down the line and maybe invest in it a bit earlier than you would normally. Also, marketing. You may be able to get started with a very bare bones website, or really not doing a ton of marketing because you have your own connections. But maybe you decide you're going to spend a bit more money on this now, because it's something you would have done down the road eventually to upgrade your website, and it's going to be beneficial for the E2 case. Similarly, hiring employees. Sometimes people will, hire an office manager, an administrative assistant, even before they apply. This can sometimes help them with certain things they need to do in the US that they may not be there to do. And anything you pay to that employee can also be included in your E2 investment schedule. It's a good idea to spend over a large number of categories. So you don't, for example, want to say, okay, I spent, $120 to get a virtual office space, and then I'm going to spend $40,000 on a really great website, and that's my expenditure. That's, again, not going to look very strong. What they want to see is that you've spent in each area that a normal business would have to spend in to get up and running. So there's certain expenditures they expect to see, right? Like the business entity setup, the website, some amount of equipment, some amount of insurance. So these are all things you want to be thinking about in terms of spending across multiple categories that any normal business would have to spend in, to get to the point of being operational. All right, let's talk about some challenges for real estate companies. So I think real estate, anytime you have a real estate company, when you're going in for an interview, you can kind of expect the officer is going to have scrutinize it a bit more closely. Part of the reason being that there are some people that will, purchase a property, put it in the name of an LLC, or maybe they have a couple, properties and they're going to do an Airbnb with them. And ultimately, the concern there is the business real and operating, or is it just you own a property and you collect passive real estate income? So that is their concern. So ultimately, like what you have to show is that the business that you're starting has the ability to operate, has the ability to hire employees. Some successful real estate ideas we've seen clients do in the past are a real estate brokerage firm, a property management company. And when people are doing this, you can manage, if you own your own properties, you can manage your own properties, but also a good idea to have it be more expansive than that and to manage, properties of other property owners, to show that you really will have, a real and operating business that can support employees. Um, Real estate renovation and construction, those can be, really viable E2 businesses. House flipping as well. Sometimes what we see if people want to do house flipping on a really small scale, maybe they have a property management company and house flipping is a small subsection of that, or they do construction and renovation, on other people's homes, but they also have a different section where they do house flipping. If the business is only flipping houses, then it really needs to be kind of done on a large scale. Again, just show that the company is real and operating, that it has the ability to hire employees. We had a client who did this, who had a portfolio of about 30 to 40 homes. Because of the size of the portfolio, the investment amount had to be very high, was over $1 million. But they had, sufficient work to show that they were, a real and operating company. So you also need to be thinking with real estate. It's a very license heavy, type of industry. So, and each state kind of has their own requirements. So when you're investigating this type of business, you want to see what licenses will I need. Sometimes there's licenses where you need a social security number to even take the test or apply to get the license. In those cases, clients may need to, kind of form a business relationship with a company that maybe does have the proper licensing, and then be able to explain to the consular officer that there's a realistic runway for them to get the license they need, to operate the business once they get their social security number. All right, moving on to discussing equity trading companies. This is another, risky area again because they're concerned about what is the volume, of the business. Is somebody just putting their stock portfolio in the name in a business entity and, trading personally or just trading for some friends? You really have to show that you have enough clients. Again, this is a highly regulated industry. Do you have the proper licenses? So a lot of the same concerns they have for real estate, they have for equity trading companies. Very often for equity trading companies, there may be a more complex structure. So you want to make sure that the entity you're applying with is going to be the one that's operating, that's hiring employees, that has cash flow and revenue. So all things to consider when you're determining what type of business to start. All right, let's talk about some reasons for E-2 denials. So one is low investment amount. So we've talked today about strategies to kind of mitigate low investment. That being said, there are some investments that are just too low, right? We had a client that came to us once, was denied, had invested, $2,000 and then had $98,000 in a business bank account. This is just too low to qualify. We advised this person. They ultimately ended up spending around $50,000 with 50,000 remaining as working capital, and were ultimately able to get their visa approved. Also, nature of the business. So, as we've just discussed, there are certain businesses that are going to attract more scrutiny. Consulting businesses, real estate, equity trading, businesses where they're concerned that there's really going to be enough volume of work that the business is real and operating, enough revenue that the business is going to be able to hire and sustain employees. So you do want to think about that. If you're going in with a business that's kind of a riskier type, you want to make sure all elements of your case are really strong. Filing location and venue can be a big reason for denial. So, as I mentioned, there are some consulates that are just much friendlier to lower investment amounts. Maybe they see a lot more kind of single owner entrepreneurs, or maybe two business partners with lower investment amounts, so they're friendlier to that. So, for example, if you apply for a change of status with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, we've gotten cases approved with investment as low as $20,000. That's extremely low. There's really no consulate I'm aware of that is as friendly to low investment amounts as USCIS is. Uh, in Toronto, they're very friendly to low investment amounts, maybe even, as low as maybe 60,000, sometimes a bit lower. But again, the lower it goes, the riskier it gets. There's also some consulates where these lower investment amounts and these small businesses really struggle. So for a lot of the consulates in Asia, they're, in Japan, Taiwan, they're very used to seeing these kind of very large multinational companies that are then sending through many employees. And so the investment amounts are very high, and they're not as familiar with these kind of single investor, applications. And so someone going there with an investment amount of about $100,000, while it may be really approvable in Toronto or London or with USCIS, they may really struggle at that consulate because the officers are used to seeing much higher amounts and are not as used to working with smaller business owners. Um, Another, these next two pieces are related. So business concern or business in a home country without employees and concern over whether the business will create jobs. These are really kind of getting at the same thing. So if you have run a similar business, like let's say you were a consultant in your home country for many, many years, and never hired anyone, and now you're coming to the US to start a similar business, they may not believe you when you have a business plan saying, yes, I'm going to hire more consultants, I'm going to hire an office manager. Because you haven't done that, because your track record shows you haven't done that, they may, look at that with more scrutiny. So in that type of case, it's really favorable to hire an employee before you file, just so you can show I've already addressed this concern. Similarly, like if they feel that you're going to come in and you're not going to be able to create jobs, that's going to be a major, roadblock for an E-2 approval. Issues with the adjudicating officer. So, consular officers are human beings. There's officers at all levels of kind of experience and expertise. Each fall, kind of there's new assignments that come through. So there's consular officers who are adjudicating cases and maybe have very little, training. Sometimes officers are having a bad day. If you do feel like you got an officer that was just extremely, unprofessional or inappropriate, or that they really didn't understand the requirements, you can always reapply. Most consulates will try to give you a different officer. They don't guarantee it, but in my experience, they really do try to accommodate for that. And then another is you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. Sometimes people apply maybe on their own or maybe with attorneys that aren't as familiar with the E-2 requirements. Maybe they've applied under the wrong passport and there's not the treaty country passport. Maybe the entire investment is secured by the assets of the E-2 company. So essentially nothing is at risk. So there can be cases like that. And for that, you would need to go back and examine, how you could go back and meet the requirements. All right, let's move to talking a little bit about E-2 visa adjudication trends. So in terms of approval rates, E-2 visa approval rates tend to be quite high. The government posted approval rates are between 80 to 90%. Our approval rate is around 98%. Although past results do not predict future outcomes, we can never guarantee that anyone's visa will be approved. That being said, we do have a good track record of helping to work with people to get their visas approved. In terms of timelines, so for London right now, they're publicly reporting a review time of 60 working days. In our experience, they're taking longer than that. Kind of at maybe much closer to 90 working days. And it does kind of fluctuate, during busy times. So for example, we're heading into the holiday season soon. That's going to be a time when timelines to get appointments will likely, be longer because the consulates take each holiday and, people may be out. In Toronto, the timelines, generally review is around 10 to 15 business days, and then you can schedule your interview. People are often able to schedule within about, maybe 2 to 4 weeks, after they get that invite for the interview, sometimes a bit sooner, sometimes a bit later. And then in general, it's very post specific. So there's many posts that have completely recovered from COVID, which is wonderful. Toronto, London, Japan spring to mind. There are some consulates that have really not recovered, where processing times are still over a year. So the consulates in Bogota, the consulates, in Turkey. Wait times for E-2s are still extremely long in certain countries. So it is an important thing to kind of talk to your attorney to understand what is going to be the time frame for processing because it is really all over the place, ranging from a few weeks to a few months to over a year. Um, I want to talk for a little bit about the difference between applying at USCIS or at a US consulate. So if you're applying with USCIS, there are some benefits. So as I mentioned, they are very receptive to lower investment amounts. Um, and if you're in the United States, let's say you came on a B1 business visa to just investigate E2 opportunities, and then for some reason it was just more favorable for you to stay, you could change your status to E2. So you have that, ability to remain in the United States. You can pay for premium processing, where you pay an additional fee to the government to get a response within 15 business days. This could be an approval, a denial, or a request for evidence. And they are more favorable to lower investment amounts. That being said, there are some significant downsides to applying with USCIS. One is that you're not going to get a visa in your passport. So you get a 2-year approval notice, but once you left the United States, like let's say after 1 year you had to leave, you had a family emergency back home, you cannot re-enter the United States using that approval notice. You would actually have to go to a US consulate, submit a brand new E-2 visa application, and get a visa stamp before you could return. And the consulate does not have to rely on the E-2 approval from USCIS. So there's some visa types where USCIS approves it, like an H or an L, and then the consulate is, often, doing a credibility check, but really is not re-adjudicating the merits of the petition when they grant the visa. That is not the case for the E-2. For the E-2, they are adjudicating the merits of the case. They are not relying on the USCIS approval. And so for people that need to travel frequently, a USCIS approval can, be very limiting. As well, for the source and trail of funds, although they will accept a lower investment amount, they're very, very strict on the source and trail of funds. They really want to see a dollar for dollar accounting of everywhere that money was. So, for example, at a consulate, if you were applying and said it's my savings from, employment, you would provide maybe your tax returns, maybe proof of you transferring the lump sum to the US business bank account. If you're applying with USCIS, they would want to see those tax returns, but they would also want to see proof of your payroll entering your bank account, being sustained there. and enough of that money coming in and then that money being transferred. And if that money was transferred out or the balance fell below a certain amount, they would want to know the source of any other money. So if you have a very complicated source and trail of funds where money has been maybe transferred or held over many, many years, sometimes applying with USCIS can be very challenging. So let's talk about applying at a consulate. So many people will apply at a U.S. consulate in their home country, where they're currently living. When you're applying with a consulate, the benefit is you will get a visa stamp in your passport. So for countries where you can get that, 2, 3, 4, 5 year visa, that can be really favorable. It allows you to travel internationally. Each time you enter, you can get 2 more years in E2 status. Consulates as well, you have that ability to, maybe have more of a holistic view of the source and trail of funds. You're not having to account for every single dollar in the same way as you are with USCIS. As well, you have an interview, so you have that opportunity to make a case for your business. So there can be, pros and cons to each option, but good to explore them, with your attorney to see which is right for you. Um, let's talk a little bit about kind of post-specific considerations. So each post is different, and they kind of have, although the law is the same, the way that they ask for the documentation, the way, the things that they focus on, are going to be different. So it's always important to check the instructions for your particular consulate. Many consulates are now asking for kind of email submissions, and they want them in particular ways and file sizes and formats. So it's always important to follow those instructions. Otherwise, they may send it back or not look at it at all. Um, Also important to know consular preferences. As I mentioned before, there's some consulates that are just used to seeing huge multinational companies that are not going to be as favorable, for these kind of smaller businesses or, small business owners. For that, it may be worth seeing, is there anywhere else I could potentially apply? Also important to note, some consulates have now asked for CPA certification of business plans. So for any kind of E2 where it's a pure startup, where there's not a record of business history, you're going to be submitting a business plan, and there's certain consulates that now require that a CPA does certify the financials in the business plan. We do have a CPA on our staff who is able to certify business plans, and it is one of the services that we offer is to draft the business plans based on information our clients give to us about, what they plan to do with their businesses. All right, let's talk about some issues and complex areas that come up with E2s, common questions we receive. So one is, do I have to hire employees before I apply for an E2 visa? And the answer is no. There's nothing in the regulations that says you have to do this. That being said, there are, anecdotally, we have clients who say, well, the officer told me I had to have employees. That seems to often happen either with kind of new officers that aren't as fully trained, as well officers that are used to seeing operating businesses that are not used to seeing these startup businesses. So while no, you do not have to hire before you apply for the E2, it can be very favorable if you're able to do it. Complicated source and trail of funds issues. This is particular to USCIS filing. So as I mentioned, if you got a gift from your uncle and the source of that money was an inheritance and there's no proof of that, and then the money has been transferred from, multiple countries, that's going to be very difficult to document for USCIS. So you may want to consider, is there any simpler way I can get this, these investment, funds? Is there any simpler way I can prove it? Um, loans are permitted for the E2 as long as the loan is either unsecured or secured by the investor's personal property. So it cannot be secured by the assets of the E2 business. We see this come up a lot in when you're purchasing a business and there's some aspect of seller financing that can be problematic because the seller financing is inherently, secured by the assets of the E2 business. So let's say you say, okay, here's the total purchase price. I'll pay 50% and 50% is seller financing that I pay off over time. That other 50% is not going to be viewed as money that's at risk. It's secured by the assets of the E2 business. Therefore, that wouldn't count, likely wouldn't be substantial. However, let's say you have a home that you own and you want to take out a second mortgage, you want to take out a home equity line of credit. That can work because that is secured by your personal asset. If you default on that loan, you're going to lose your personal asset. They feel like, okay, you've put your money at risk here. Um, Gifts can also be used for E2 investment. However, the gift giver has to be willing to provide their financial documents to show where the money came from. So you could not provide just a gift letter and nothing else. You would have to show the same documentation you'd have to show if it was your money. So if the gift is from your mother and it's her personal savings from employment, she has to be willing to provide her tax returns. So before you go the gift route, you want to make sure that the gift giver is comfortable providing that documentation. Looking at E2 visas for two investors, this is possible, but it does need to be owned 50-50 if each person wants to be an investor. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. Sometimes people will get their visa, particularly if it's, many years, maybe a 5-year visa, and they think that it allows them to work in the United States. Excuse me, in the United States. It does, but only for the business that has been represented to the consulate and only in the area that, was outlined in the business plan. So um, substantive changes to the business after filing could potentially invalidate the visa. So for example, if your ownership, like let's say you have 100% of a company and then you sell 70% of it to a US citizen and now you own 30%, that business really no longer qualifies as an E2 company because it's not majority owned by a treaty country national. Therefore, even if your visa had 4 years left on it, technically you're really not maintaining your status anymore and that visa should not be used. Similarly, changes in the type of business, if they're major substantial changes. So let's say you had a wedding photography business and you want to add on, a blog that's, selling your photographs, that in itself is not really a substantial change. But let's say you want to shut down your wedding photography business and start up a restaurant. So that's going to be substantial change. Before you make that type of change, you have to go back to the consulate, or to USCIS, present new documentation. They may ask for new evidence of, investment before you can start with this new business line. So one thing you may want to do if you're contemplating multiple different types of businesses at the start, you may want to put that into your business plan to give you the flexibility to argue that you don't have to go back and report to USCIS or the consulate each time you make a change. Let's say that you're doing software consulting, but you also really want to build that mobile app. So you put mobile app development in your business plan, and now you don't need to go back because it's already been disclosed as part of your business. Um, Another thing that can come up are family business purchases. I've talked about this a few other times in the presentation, but if you are purchasing a business from a family member, they're going to look at that with more scrutiny. They're going to look at the financials. They really want more assurance that what you're paying for the business is really the fair market value. So that's where it's always good to have an objective third party evaluation or maybe CPA. And again, the purchase price should make sense in light of the financials. All right, so I think we can move now to seeing if we had any questions that came in. And I believe we have two. All right, so this first one, I have a question. If the applicant has experience in IT, having an aspiration to buy a franchise of a food business, will there be any negative impact? However, the partner has experience in the food industry. So yeah, so this is a common question. You don't have to have specific experience in the business that you're setting up. It is better if you do, right? Like, but that being said, we had many cases where people maybe had, some other type of background and now they want to, start up a gas station or they want to buy an ice cream shop or they want to, be a wedding photographer. I think that usually what we try to do is use anything from your resume that is like if you've worked in customer service, if you've worked in finance, those are all really necessary skills for an entrepreneur. So we'll always kind of work on that. And then, yes, if you have a partner who is experienced in the business, that's going to be helpful as well. Um, Another question, do I need to start running the business before applying for the E-2? Is that possible if I don't have an SSN? So no, you don't have to start running the business before applying for the E-2, but the business does need to be at the point where it could be operational quickly after you get the visa. To give you an example, I had a client who was opening a gym. When she went for her interview, they said, if I went to your gym, what would I see? They said, she said, I've got my equipment there, my point of sale service is there. All that's really needed is for me to come and turn on the lights. I think even if she'd said, I've got my equipment there, everything's shipped, it's all in boxes, but like once I get my E-2, I'll be able to come and, start like set it fully up. And then in the next month or two, we'll be running. That would be fine as well. So no, you don't have to be running it before applying. And having the SSN can be helpful, but is not not required. Someone said, I started investing before I got my Canadian citizenship. Is that going to impact my case? Can I run my business while I'm not Canadian from outside the US? So it's okay if you are like, it's okay if you're investing before you got your Canadian citizenship. The important thing is at the time you're applying for the E-2 visa, you must have that Canadian passport. You also need to have the proper source of funds documenting, anything that you've spent. Um, and yes, you can run your business from outside the United States. From the US immigration perspective, what they care about is where are you physically. So if you are physically in the US, you cannot be working at that business. That being said, if you're running a business from outside the US remotely and you start to visit a lot, like on a, Canadians are visa exempt, but like as a tourist or a business visitor, that's something they could start to question. So that is something to keep in mind. Um, Someone's asking, can you apply at any consulate or only at one in your own country? So you cannot apply at any consulate. I mean, consulates they have you can apply at any consulate where you are residing. So if you live in a country, like let's say you live in France, but you have a passport for, Greece, the fact that you live in France, full time you reside there, there is a strong argument the consulate should take your case. Hypothetically, consulates can take the case of anyone who's physically in their district, but our experience, especially with E-2s, is that they will not. Generally, you need to go to the country where you have a passport or the country where you're residing full time. And even sometimes, if you're residing full time in a country, they still might send you to your home country. One caveat, if you are in the United States on a status, like let's say you're on an F1 student visa, you can apply for the E-2 at the consulate in Toronto, assuming you can get a Canadian visa. When purchasing an existing business and escrow is used, how is the funds at risk question answered? So the way that that works with escrow is that you have to have actually signed a purchase sale agreement and every condition for the sale to go through has to be satisfied except the E-2 approval. So it basically the money is at risk because it's transferred to a third party escrow agent who is not representing the buyer or the seller. And the escrow agent has instructions that say, if the E-2 is approved, the money goes to the seller. If the E-2 is denied, the money goes to the buyer. So they consider it at risk because you've satisfied all conditions. The money will go to the seller if the E-2 visa is approved. So that's how that works. If I want to start a home organization business and run the business at home, can I set up a business mailbox? If my clients want to hire me to do interior design work, do I need to apply for a different E-2? For this, I would recommend that you just contemplate both service lines in your business plan initially. It's going to be, like the startup kind of costs you would have for the interior design business are going to be very similar to the home organization business. So I would say just to, not have to go back at a later time, you would want to just contemplate in your business plan, like maybe in year two, we're going to start offering interior design services if that's what you plan to do. Um, can I make my 23-year-old daughter a 50-cent partner for her E-2? So we have had this happen before where parents maybe own a business 50-50 with their child who's very young. I think that it can work, but the child needs to have their own substantial investment that should not come from the parent if the parent also owns the business. Additionally, younger applicants are going to receive more scrutiny. So you would want to make sure that the type of business that's being started, the daughter has some experience in, or maybe can take some courses in, some training, some certifications. So it can work, but it is a riskier scenario. Can you please share some views on the trucking business requirement? So I'm not sure exactly what this is asking, but I mean, trucking, we have done trucking businesses for E-2s. I think similar to kind of real estate and equity trading, they can be scrutinized. Again, the concern is how active is this business going to be? Have you just purchased one truck and you're going to have one truck driver? So those businesses are more successful, I think, when you have a kind of a larger fleet. You're able to invest in a larger fleet, and sometimes that's going to come with higher initial investment amount. Someone's mentioned we have a new government in the US, any negative impact on E-2 approvals. So in the prior administration, the one that's going to come back into power in January, we did not see an appreciable impact on E-2 visa approvals. The approval rates stayed pretty similar. The law didn't change. There was some policy that shifted towards more focus on, kind of evaluating E-2s under the context of an executive order called Buy American, Hire American. So we were advising our clients, you want to spend more of your investment in the United States. You want to, work more on hiring employees before filing, but we don't anticipate any significant negative changes, and certainly we didn't see any last time. I am on an F1 student visa. How can I do my OPT on an E-2 visa? So if you're a student, you'll get a year of OPT. During that OPT period, you can be self-employed. You would have to, start your own company, talk to your designated school official. Um, and then you could apply for the E-2 visa, at a certain point, during maybe like while your OPT was ongoing. So you don't kind of do your OPT on an E-2 visa, but you could do your OPT to kind of get your business, to the point of being able to operate, and then apply for the E-2 visa, when your OPT is coming to an end. Um, is it possible to change to long-term status, such as a green card, after running the startup for several years under E-2? So there is no kind of direct path from any non-immigrant visa to a green card, right? Like you're never going to automatically qualify for a green card because you've been on an E-2 for a certain number of years, or an H-1B, or an L, or anything like that. That being said, there are green card options that can be available to E-2 visa holders. One option that we've been using more for our entrepreneurial clients is the EB-2 National Interest Waiver. So this is where if somebody has either, an advanced degree or equivalent, or exceptional ability in their field as a threshold matter, and then they are working on an endeavor of substantial merit and national importance, and they're well positioned to advance it. Sometimes we have clients where their business has, you know, doing something really important for the United States, maybe something in engineering, maybe something scientific, maybe it's something where they've gotten a lot of VC funding. So the EB2 NIW can be a good option for entrepreneurs as a green card option down the line. Similarly, the EB5, if people are really investing, significant funds into the company, significant personal funds, that can be something that, can be a pathway. You do have to invest either 800,000 or, $1,050,000 of your personal funds. You can't kind of just reinvest retained earnings into the company. You actually have to pay yourself, pay taxes, reinvest. So if you are going from E2 to EB5 and you're making the investment over time, you want to make sure you're working with an attorney from the very start, because certain things that can qualify as E2 investment do not qualify as EB5 investment. So for example, for E2, legal fees can count. They don't count for EB5. Or for E2, if you're purchasing a business, that can be a substantial investment. But for EB5, purchasing a business is not an investment. There are important differences and things to note. So I think, this last question here I kind of just answered, which is some of the E2 investment can likely be counted, but again, you want to be telling the attorney from the start, my goal is EB5, because the amount that they will look into the source of funds for E2 is extremely minimal compared to EB5. For EB5, they're going to ask for significantly more documentation, so you want to be planning for that from the start. All right. I think those were all of our questions. So thank you everyone for your great questions. Thank you, Jelena, for joining as well. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.